I was told by my daughter I couldn't afford my husband's birthday dinner. Then the staff greeted me as the owner. They always said birthdays bring people together. Laughter, candles, clinking glasses, all the things meant to remind you of where you belong. But on the night my husband turned 65, I learned exactly where I stood. Not at the table, not in the toasts, certainly not in the budget. I was told, with a gentle hand on my wrist and a performative wince, that this year's dinner would be just for close family. That maybe next year, if I planned ahead, I could join. As though the years I spent beside that man, building a life from scraps and silence, somehow didn't qualify me for a seat. As though love had a price tag, and I came up short. They chose the most exclusive restaurant in the city. Of course they did. Polished wood floors, bespoke cocktails, wait lists measured in months. It was the kind of place that made people feel important just by being allowed through the door. And yet, when they arrived, all dressed for applause, armed with stories and shallow smiles, they were met not by a host, but by a man in a crisp suit who looked past them and said, "She's already here. Right this way, Mrs. Sinclair." The table had already been set. For me. Because what they didn't know, what they'd never bothered to ask, was that this restaurant, this moment, this empire, was mine. And tonight, respect would be served alongside the entree. Think of the one person who broke you. Got them? Let's begin. It was supposed to be a simple conversation, a phone call, nothing more. But there was a weight in her voice before she even said it, a rehearsed politeness too smooth to be sincere. "Hey, Mom," she began, drawing the words out like warm taffy. "So, we've been finalizing the head count for Dad's birthday dinner." Head count. As though it were a board meeting and not a celebration of the man I'd shared my life with for over 4 decades. I waited. "There's just not a lot of room this year," she continued, her voice careful, clipped. "You know how expensive that place is. We're covering the bill ourselves and, well, it's already tight." I didn't say anything at first. I didn't have to. The silence between us was so thick it nearly suffocated the call. She rushed to fill it. "It's not that we don't want you there," she said quickly, the lie spilling out before it could be dressed properly. "It's just, it's complicated with the reservation. We had to trim the list." Trim the list. I wasn't a guest to her. I was a line item on a spreadsheet, an expense to cut, an afterthought. I could have asked her to reconsider. I could have reminded her how I had been there through every one of her birthdays, from lopsided homemade cakes to ballroom banquets. How I'd stayed up sewing costumes for her school plays, how I held her hand after her first heartbreak, how I'd paid the deposit for her wedding when her fiancé's family forgot. But I didn't. I simply said, "I understand," because it was the only thing I could say without cracking. She seemed relieved. That was the part that stayed with me. The breath of ease that followed my quiet acceptance, as though she'd dodged something uncomfortable, something embarrassing. Me. After we hung up, I sat at the edge of my bed for a long time, the phone still warm in my palm. I looked around at the room that once held the noise of our life, laughter, arguments, late-night whispers, and realized how silent it had become. Not empty, just paused. He didn't know. My husband. He assumed I'd be there. Of course he did. He would never have agreed to anything else. But they hadn't told him. They'd planned the whole thing without me. Timelines, guests, menu. And I had become a logistical inconvenience in a night that should have been about love. I didn't cry. There was no anger in me. Only a quiet sting, like stepping into a room and realizing the lights had already been turned off behind you. They thought they were doing me a favor by sparing me the cost. What they didn't know was that the only thing more expensive than the meal that night was the mistake of underestimating me. and I planned to let them pay for both. With interest. I wasn't supposed to be there. Not according to the plan, at least. But I'd made the reservation myself 2 months earlier, under a different name. One that didn't raise alarms. One they wouldn't think to look for. I'd called it a precaution at the time, a quiet instinct I didn't question. And as I sat alone in a private corner of the restaurant that night, close enough to see the glitter of their wine glasses, but far enough to remain unseen, I understood why. The room was glowing with soft candlelight, gold accents dancing on every surface. My husband sat at the center of a long table, surrounded by smiles that had been curated, rehearsed. Our daughter had done her best to stage the evening like a show, a performance of celebration. She played hostess with clipped charm, checking on drink orders, making toasts that dripped with flattery and filtered nostalgia. He looked handsome. Tired, but handsome. 65 years of quiet labor written gently across his face. He glanced around often, smiling at the guests, nodding to the staff. But occasionally, his gaze lingered on the door, as if waiting for something, or someone, who hadn't arrived. I knew that look. I had worn it myself too many times. There was an empty chair at the end of the table, a space no one acknowledged. A mistake, perhaps, in their planning. Or maybe it had been meant for me, before the final headcount was cut for budget. Either way, it sat untouched, a quiet reminder that something was missing. I watched as my daughter leaned over to whisper something into Greg's ear. Her husband, always so careful not to meet my eyes on the rare occasions we were in the same room. They laughed, not cruelly, just lightly, like people who had already forgotten what they'd done. The servers moved like water, trained and invisible, pouring wine and setting down plates like choreography. One of them passed near my table and gave me the smallest nod of recognition. The kind you offer not to a stranger, but to someone who owns the keys. I returned it without a word. The irony was sharp. They'd picked this place because it was exclusive, because it would impress. A 5-star jewel, tucked behind unassuming doors. They didn't know that behind those doors, the woman they'd excluded had once walked through with blueprints in her hand and a vision no one else believed in. I didn't stay long. Just enough to see the cake brought out, the song sung, the obligatory photos taken. My husband smiled, but there was a sliver of something behind his eyes. Something distant, like he was holding space for someone he thought might still appear. She wouldn't. Not that night. Instead, she left through the back, unnoticed, stepping into the quiet city air with dignity intact and a secret waiting to be served. Because the next course wasn't on the menu. It was coming from me. There's a particular tone people use when they want to insult you without sounding unkind. It's light, sweetened just enough to hide the edge beneath. Like offering someone a sugar cube laced with poison. My daughter used that tone when she said it. Cheerful, apologetic, fake as a party store smile. Maybe next year if you save up. She said it with a laugh, as though it were a joke we were both in on. Like I should be grateful for the suggestion. Like I should be touched that she was already imagining a place for me in some future celebration. The truth, of course, was that she never intended to make room. Not then. Not later. That line wasn't a gesture. It was dismissal dressed in silk. I didn't answer her right away. I remember looking at the screen, her name glowing in that familiar font, and wondering when the distance between us had become so vast. When she'd stopped seeing me as a woman and started seeing me as a liability. It wasn't the money. Not really. She didn't know the first thing about my accounts. She assumed, and I let her. That was my mistake. I thought humility was the higher road. That staying quiet made me gracious. But now I saw the result. Invisibility. I remembered painfully all the years I'd poured into her without hesitation. The school fees I paid when her husband was laid off. The time I sold a necklace to help with the down payment on their first home. I never told them it had been a gift from her father on our 10th anniversary. I just smiled and said I had a little extra tucked away. Because that's what mothers do, isn't it? We give without keeping receipts. But she had kept hers, carefully. And this year, I didn't fit the budget. Don't be upset, she added, as though that settled it. You'll have your own little celebration with Dad, right? Something quiet and sweet. Maybe dinner at home? Dinner at home. Alone. While they toasted his name over truffle risotto and Bordeaux wine, I'd be expected to light a candle over a grocery store cake and pretend it was enough. Because I was old. Because I was simple. Because they had decided that was my place now. I smiled through the call. I even told her I was proud of her, that I hoped everything went well. And when we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table, opened my old binder of business documents, and flipped to the page I hadn't touched in months. The one with the restaurant name printed in gold. The lease. The investment structure. The signature. My signature. She thought I couldn't afford the dinner. She didn't know I'd bought the building. And next year, they wouldn't need to save up. They'd just need to ask for a reservation. Under my name. I asked for a table in the far corner, near the window, but with a clear view of the main dining room. Not hidden, not flaunted, just present. The hostess led me there with a warm smile and a gentle, "Of course, Mrs. Sinclair." No hesitation, no question. That name still carried weight in this place, even if my own daughter had chosen to forget it. I ordered sparkling water. No appetizer, no meal. Just the glass bottle with its silver label, poured carefully by a waiter who knew exactly who I was and why I was there. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. The entire staff had been trained to treat me with quiet reverence, not because I demanded it, but because they knew I was the reason this building still stood. The first pop of laughter from their table hit like a slap. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't meant for me. That's what made it worse. They weren't thinking of me at all. My daughter leaned over to whisper something to her husband, her hair swept into a sleek bun, her earrings glittering in the low light. She looked like she had it all together. She always did. But she didn't know she was dining on borrowed grace. My grace. I watched as the food arrived, plates arranged like artwork, sauces painted in swirls, garnish placed with precision. I remembered when those dishes were just sketches on a whiteboard in my husband's office, back when this place was still a dream with too many zeros and not enough believers. He had cooked those recipes for me first, in our kitchen at midnight, still in his chef's coat, tasting and tweaking while I sipped wine and told him what was missing. And now, here they were, served to a table that had carved out a celebration with my absence, like it was an upgrade. The sparkling water was cold, sharp. It caught in my throat a little. I took small sips, steady, because I refused to let my hands shake. But the tears came anyway. Not a storm, not a spectacle. Just a quiet gathering in the corners of my eyes. They stayed there. Unwelcome guests I blinked away before they could fall. Because I would not give them that. I had every right to be at that table. Not because of money or ownership, but because I loved the man they were celebrating more purely, more fully, than anyone else there. I had stood beside him through lean years, through broken ovens and unpaid invoices, through nights when this place nearly didn't survive. I was the constant. But tonight, I was invisible. And that was fine. Because they didn't see me coming. They didn't see the letter I'd instructed the maitre d' to deliver with the dessert course. They didn't know the bill would arrive addressed to me, not as a guest, but as the owner. And they didn't hear the staff refer to me as Mrs. Sinclair, with respect, not pity. But they would. The reservation had been made under my daughter's name, Julia Monroe, booked exactly 41 days in advance, at the very edge of the window when most people scrambled for cancellations. She had called 3 times to confirm, once to request the corner booth, and once more to inquire about dessert options, noting that her father had refined tastes. I know because the manager forwarded the notes to me personally, as per protocol. Not because I asked, but because, as majority owner, everything passed through me eventually. They thought they'd secured something exclusive. What they didn't know was that the very exclusivity they were so proud of existed because I insisted on it. The limited tables, the seasonal menus, the wait list that made people feel like they'd earned something special. That was me. I'd insisted we create the kind of space where memories felt expensive, not in price, but in intimacy. I helped design the lighting so no one ever looked washed out in photos. I approved the staff wardrobe down to the cuffs and stitching. My fingerprints were everywhere. And yet, I had been deemed too ordinary to attend. That night, I watched as they marveled at the attention they received. Special greetings from the sommelier, personalized place cards, a complimentary bottle of wine delivered with our compliments. Julia glowed with the illusion that it was all for her planning, her taste, her father's milestone. She didn't know the wine was from my private collection, the name handwritten on each card in the same ink I'd used to sign the very first investment papers for this place years ago. It had been my husband's dream, yes, but I was the one who made it a reality. He had the fire, I had the map. And now the place bore his touch in the kitchen, and mine in every single detail that held it together. I had stayed quiet long enough. With dessert, I had asked the maitre d' to deliver a single envelope. No dramatic flourish. Just a simple delivery to Julia's side of the table, timed to land precisely between the espresso and the final toast. The note inside was brief. Next time, check with the owner before you assume she can't afford a seat at her own table. E.S. I watched her read it. Twice. Her eyes narrowed first in confusion, then widened in recognition. The letters E.S. didn't register right away, but when she looked up and saw me across the room, calmly sipping my water, the color drained from her face like spilled cream into coffee. She finally saw me. Not as the quiet, forgettable mother with a modest smile, but as the woman who held the deed, the table, the room, and the lesson. They had made the reservation, but the realization? That belonged to me. They say power is loud, measured in raised voices, slammed doors, a seat at the head of the table. But I've always believed real power is quiet. It's in the decisions made before anyone knows they matter. It's in the fine print, the signatures that don't need fanfare. It's in a name that no one thinks to look for until it's far too late. Mine was there all along, tucked neatly into the lease documents for Le Jardin, page 3, under primary investor, and again on page 6 beside property rights and controlling interest. Elaine Sinclair. Written in black ink, in a hand I had perfected long before my daughter could even hold a pen. The first time I toured the space, it was just drywall and blueprints. My husband saw a restaurant. I saw a future. While he dreamed up menus and open kitchens, I met with lawyers and tax advisors. I didn't mind that my name never made the website or the press releases. Let them praise the chef. Let the spotlight find him. I preferred the shadows, where the real work happened. We agreed on it early. We would build something together, but keep it protected, shielded, quiet. So I invested through a private holding company. Not for secrecy, but for strength. Because I had learned, through years of being underestimated, that people treat your value like a rumor, true only if spoken aloud. So I let them believe I was just the woman who made sure the napkins were ironed and the books balanced. Just the wife. Just the mother. Let them. When Julia was growing up, she used to watch me at the dining room table sorting through paperwork and ask why I never went into real business. I remember laughing. I had never left it. She just didn't recognize what it looked like on a woman who didn't need to boast. And now, the lease. That quiet little document that meant everything. It gave me authority. Final say. Control. The very thing they had tried to strip from me when they made the decision to exclude me. When Julia said there wasn't room for me, when she told me to save up for next year, she had no idea she was speaking to the woman who could revoke the reservation altogether. But I didn't. I let them have their evening. I let them sit beneath chandeliers I chose, eat from china I approved, toast in chairs I paid for. Because I didn't need to prove anything with noise. I had already done it with ink. My name wasn't on the invitation. It was on the lease. And that, as they learned with every passing minute of that dinner, was the only name that ever really mattered. They toasted to him like they knew him. They clinked glasses and told stories, safe ones, polished for polite company. They called him brilliant, said things like visionary and self-made, as if that kind of success arrives on its own, delivered like a soufflé without anyone sweating in the kitchen. The guests adored the idea of my husband, the celebrated chef. They adored the restaurant, the ambiance, the curated version of him they read about in the food columns. But not one of them knew how many nights he came home too tired to eat, or how often I'd find him asleep on the floor of our living room, shoes still on, apron stained, the scent of garlic and ambition clinging to his skin. They didn't know he used to practice plating techniques on our old dinnerware, balancing sauces on chipped plates because we couldn't afford new ones yet. They didn't know I was the one who ironed his coats, who fixed the buttons when they fell off minutes before an opening night. I handled the invoices, the inventory, the suppliers who suddenly lost their shipments until someone with a husband's last name stepped in. They didn't see that side of it. They saw him as a lone success. And me? As the woman who probably couldn't cover her own entree. Julia's friends especially liked to marvel at his rise. "Your dad's a genius," one of them said that night, twirling a fork in her risotto, which I knew had been his 5th attempt at perfecting the texture. "You're so lucky to have grown up around that." Lucky. As if the smell of burned trial batches at 2 a.m. and missed birthdays for catering gigs had been a charmed upbringing. As if I hadn't been the one holding everything together so he could build something lasting. I never wanted credit, but I did deserve respect. Instead, over the years, I became background noise. The woman who answered the house phone. The one who refilled the wine and made sure everyone got home safely. I became the extra chair, the assumed babysitter, the person they forgot to thank when they made their speeches. And now, watching them sip champagne at a table I had paid for, under lights I had chosen, in a restaurant built from the marrow of our marriage, they still didn't see me. But I saw them. I saw the girl who used to sneak under my desk as I sorted balance sheets. I saw the son-in-law who once asked me for help with his first resume. And I saw my husband, looking at the door now and then, his smile dimming ever so slightly when he realized I hadn't shown up. But I had. They just didn't know it yet. Because sometimes, the best way to be seen is to let them speak, until the silence reveals what they never bothered to ask. And when they finally looked, they'd find I had always been there, not just beside him, behind it all. The table by the window wasn't part of their reservation. It wasn't on the seating chart or within their line of sight when they walked in, dressed in curated elegance and clouded certainty. But it was mine. I'd chosen it weeks ago, specifically for the view, not of the skyline, but of them. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want drama. I just wanted the moment. The one where they'd have to look up from their assumptions and see me, not as an afterthought, not as someone they'd left off the list, but as the thread they'd never stopped pulling from. The table was round, tucked into a soft corner under a narrow arched window. The lighting was gentle there, warm without being theatrical. I wore navy, simple, sharp, familiar. The same color I wore the day we signed the first lease. No jewelry but my wedding ring, and the delicate watch he'd given me on our 20th anniversary. The one Julia had said looked too modest for someone trying to make an impression. From where I sat, I could see the curve of my husband's shoulders, the way he smiled politely at stories he'd heard before. He laughed when prompted, nodded when expected. But he looked tired. Not just from age or work, from performance. He wasn't a man who ever craved applause. He only ever wanted his kitchen, his food, and someone to share it with who understood why it all mattered. That used to be me. I didn't expect him to notice me right away. I was in the periphery, deliberately placed. But when the maitre d' approached their table near the end of the meal, envelope in hand, posture practiced, and handed Julia the folded note with my initials, it began. She opened it slowly, read the line once, then again. Her eyes stopped blinking, and then she looked up. I was already watching. Our eyes locked across the room. Her mouth parted slightly, but no sound came. Her husband leaned in to see what the fuss was about, but she said nothing. Her expression did all the speaking. Confusion melting into realization, realization hardening into discomfort. And then finally, the shape of guilt. My husband followed her gaze, turning in his seat. And when he saw me, when his eyes finally met mine, he didn't look surprised. He looked relieved. He stood. He didn't say a word to the others. He simply placed his napkin down with care, the way he always did, and walked across the restaurant, steps sure and steady, like he'd known I was here all along. When he reached me, he pulled out the chair beside mine and sat down. No speech, no apology, just his hand, resting gently over mine, warm and familiar. And just like that, everything shifted. Because I hadn't needed to fight for the seat at their table. I had already built my own. There's a certain weight in being properly addressed. Not out of obligation, not out of politeness, but out of recognition. Mrs. Sinclair. It wasn't extravagant. It wasn't theatrical. It was said plainly, with respect. And that, more than anything, was what made it powerful. Because my daughter had spent the last few years pretending she'd forgotten who I was, as if mother, wife, partner, those titles, were relics to be shelved. But the staff never forgot. Not once. The moment I walked through the private entrance that evening, the maitre d' stood a little straighter. His voice softened with something that felt like reverence. "Welcome, Mrs. Sinclair," he said, and he meant it. He didn't glance behind me to see who I was with. He didn't question my presence. He didn't ask if I had a reservation. I was the reservation. He escorted me to the table by the window like he was leading royalty to her throne, not with pomp, but with quiet knowing. On the way, the bartender gave me a subtle nod, and the head chef, who had studied under my husband and knew exactly who held the keys to this place, peeked out of the kitchen just long enough to offer a small, respectful bow. It wasn't performance. It was memory. They remembered the woman who'd written checks when payroll ran tight, who'd come in early to proof menus and stayed late to negotiate lease terms in whispered conversations. They remembered what my daughter chose to ignore. It wasn't until later, after my husband had crossed the floor to join me, that Julia truly noticed. From across the room, she watched him slide into the seat beside me, his hand resting calmly over mine, his smile returning in a way I hadn't seen in years. She had planned the evening so carefully, the speeches, the wine, the curated guest list designed to reinforce her version of the family story. But all of that fell quiet the moment she heard the staff say it again as dessert was being served. "Would you like to approve the final course, Mrs. Sinclair?" It wasn't just a title. It was placement. position, authority. Her fork paused in midair. She'd grown so used to seeing me as the woman who sat quietly at the corner of the room, the one who nodded and accommodated and never asked for credit. She'd buried the truth under assumptions, that I was ordinary, that I'd lost whatever strength I once had, that my silence was proof of absence. But that night, the staff reminded her what she refused to say out loud. They greeted me not just as the owner, but as the woman who had built something lasting. The woman who had made room for everyone else while she stood on the sidelines, unseen. They saw me. They named me. And in doing so, they did what my daughter never found the grace or the courage to do. They gave me back my name. There's a hush that falls in a room when something unplanned begins to unfold. An unscripted moment that rearranges everyone's understanding of the evening. That hush arrived the instant I stood. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't rise like someone seeking attention. I simply placed my napkin on the table, gently, as I had done at 1,000 dinners before. My husband, still seated beside me, looked up with a calm sort of pride. He didn't stop me. He didn't need to. We had lived a lifetime of moments that belonged to everyone else. This one was mine. Their table fell quiet before I said a word. Julia's laughter died in her throat mid-sentence. Forks stilled, glasses hovered. I stepped forward, each click of my heel soft but sure against the polished floor. A few guests looked confused. Others turned, watching the woman they didn't quite recognize. Some thought I was a distant relative. Others assumed I was just a curious bystander. But Julia knew. Her face was frozen somewhere between disbelief and dread, as if she had finally seen the ghost of someone she thought she'd buried in excuses. I walked toward their table, not quickly, not slowly. I let the space fill with the tension they had created. Then I stopped, just beside the table where my husband's birthday had unfolded without me. I looked at him first. He smiled, genuine, proud, steady, and nodded once. It was all I needed. My voice didn't tremble. "I just wanted to thank you all for coming tonight," I said, letting the words carry in the quiet room. "It means the world to see such love gathered around the man who built so much, with passion, with grit, and with unwavering faith in something greater than himself." Some of them began to smile. They still didn't fully understand. "And thank you," I continued, turning slightly to the maitre d', "for hosting such a lovely evening, as always." He gave the slightest bow. That's when the shift began. Eyes darted, mouths parted. People began to understand. The woman they had mistaken for a background player had just addressed the staff like a conductor speaks to her orchestra. Julia's hands tightened around her napkin. She looked to Greg, who looked to the manager, whose eyes were fixed respectfully on me. The guests followed the gaze. And then someone, maybe one of the new sous chefs who hadn't even been born when this restaurant first opened, started to clap. It wasn't a standing ovation, just a few palms meeting, slow, uncertain, and then more joined, like people trying to make sense of what they'd overlooked. Applause, yes, but late. Too late to undo the exclusion. Too late to erase the discomfort etched into the lines of Julia's carefully powdered face. But not too late for me to feel, if only for a moment, that justice had found a rhythm. Because sometimes the room doesn't rise for you when it should. But if you've built the room yourself, it rises eventually. They'd chosen Le Jardin for its exclusivity, the same way people choose designer labels they don't understand. To them, it was a trophy of taste, a flex masked as family tradition. It was where important people dined, where reservations whispered status, and the wine list required a translator. Julia had said it was the perfect place to honor Dad, but what she really meant was it was the perfect place to be seen. She hadn't chosen it for him. She'd chosen it for the photo. And yet, She had told me I couldn't afford it. She said it gently, of course. All of it was said gently. That I probably wouldn't enjoy the menu. That it was a bit much. And that it would be better to celebrate Dad separately. The way one might talk to someone they believe lives in coupons and clearance racks. She didn't know. Or maybe she didn't want to know. That the woman she dismissed was the reason they could even get a table in the first place. That long before the gold accents and award-winning reviews, I had walked this very floor in flats and a spreadsheet, running numbers while contractors argued over backsplash tiles. The truth is, Julia had never asked how we made it all work. As a child, she was too young. As an adult, she was too comfortable. She assumed her father's name built this place. But it was mine that signed the checks when our chef investors walked away. Mine that negotiated the real estate. Mine that paid the staff through the winter after a pipe burst and no insurance claim came through. Mine that secured the expansion loan under a secondary holding company. Shielded, silent, necessary. But she'd decided I didn't belong here. So I let them sit in the house I built. I let them dine on my dime, drink from my cellar, and toast under my chandeliers. I let Julia raise her glass and smile wide for the photos she would post with hashtags about love and legacy, all while dismissing the woman who made it possible. And when the bill arrived, sleek leather folder, handwritten thank you note inside, I watched her expression carefully. It was small at first, a crease in the brow, a second glance, then the shift. "Mom?" she had whispered, eyes wide as the final page revealed the truth. Paid in full. E. Sinclair, owner's account. There was no drama, just silence. Her husband said nothing. Her friends looked down. Even the server, trained to remain invisible, stood a little straighter. She looked at me like a stranger. I looked back like a mirror. Because in that moment, she wasn't seeing her mother. She was seeing the woman who could afford more than the bill. She was seeing the woman they thought couldn't get in, but in fact, owned the front door. The dessert had been plated with the usual care. A trio of delicate sweets, pistachio creme brulee, dark chocolate torte, and a rosewater tartlet, each garnished with gold leaf and quiet indulgence. It was the kind of ending meant to impress, to signal that everything before it had been leading to this. But this time, the final course wasn't what arrived on the plate. It came from me. They had just begun to lift their forks when I stood again, gently, with the same calm that had unsettled Julia the first time. The restaurant hushed once more, as if the room itself understood that something unplanned was about to unfold. My husband looked up from his untouched tart, his hand still resting lightly on the base of his wine glass, and smiled at me with the kind of look that said, "Go ahead." The kind of look that only comes from years of knowing someone's strength, even when others can't see it. "I'd like to say a few words," I said simply, and no one moved to stop me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The silence did half the work for me. This restaurant has seen many nights like this one. Tables filled with laughter, stories, celebration. I've watched them all, from this side of the room, from the back office, sometimes from a seat just like yours. I let the words breathe. "My husband," I continued, placing my hand lightly on his shoulder, "is the heart behind every dish you tasted tonight. His hands crafted this place, but they weren't the only ones. There were others behind the scenes, signing the leases, managing the chaos, making sure the lights stayed on and the doors stayed open when the ovens broke and the bills outnumbered the guests." I let my eyes find Julia's. "You once told me I couldn't afford to come tonight, that there wasn't room for me, that maybe next year, if I saved up, I could join." Her cheeks flushed, but she didn't look away. "But what none of you knew," I said, letting my voice remain soft but steady, "is that I didn't need an invitation. Because this celebration, this table, this restaurant, it was never beyond my reach. I paused, then smiled gently. I just chose, for years, not to speak about what I had built. Not because I lacked pride, but because I never needed applause. I turned toward the kitchen, where the head chef now stood in the doorway, arms folded, eyes shining. So tonight, let the final course be more than dessert. Let it be a reminder. And then, with perfect timing, the maitre d' stepped forward and said the words that would echo longer than any toast that night. On behalf of the ownership, we thank you for dining at Le Jardin. Ownership, not guest, not wife, not mother, owner. The forks lowered. The fireworks, I later heard, went off just after midnight over the city skyline. But my spark? It had already been lit. She said it with a tremble in her voice, just above a whisper, after the guests had filtered out and the candles burned low. The statement wasn't angry or defensive. It wasn't even a question. It was an admission. A soft, stunned sentence that hung in the space between us like steam rising from a dish, left too long untouched. But we thought you were struggling. That was it. 6 words that revealed far more about her than they did about me. They had built an entire perception of me out of fragments, half-stories, misread silences, a wardrobe too practical, a car too modest, birthday gifts that were always thoughtful, never extravagant. They saw those things and decided I had fallen behind, that I had shrunk, that somewhere between my quiet retirement and my husband's steady ascent, I had become someone to pity, someone to budget around, someone they could remove from a guest list without consequence. They confused discretion for desperation, and they never asked. Never once. I turned toward her, and for the first time in years, I didn't see my daughter. I saw a woman suddenly unsure of the ground beneath her. She had built herself a narrative where she was the one lifting others up, where I was the one to be managed and explained. And now, faced with the reality that the very ground she stood on bore my name, she looked lost. I wasn't struggling, I said calmly, the edges of my words rounded with exhaustion, not bitterness. I was simply quiet. And it was true. I had spent so long behind the curtain that even I had started to forget how powerful silence can be. But silence doesn't mean absence, and humility doesn't mean lack. While they were measuring worth in visible things, in handbags, dinner checks, Instagram-perfect events, I was stacking equity, building partnerships, investing in things that lasted longer than applause. She sank slightly into her chair, the truth landing heavier than she expected. Her husband said nothing, his eyes down, suddenly aware of every assumption he'd ever voiced behind closed doors. The cost of their assumptions wasn't financial. It wasn't even public embarrassment. It was something quieter, more permanent. They lost something that can't be recaptured by an apology or repaid with gifts. They lost the chance to stand beside me when it would have mattered. They lost the opportunity to know me, not as a mother who stood in the background, but as a woman who had been leading from the shadows all along. I didn't gloat. I didn't scold. I just looked at her and let the silence stretch, because sometimes the absence of comfort is the only space where truth can echo. Then I stood, gathered my coat, and turned toward the door. I wasn't struggling, I said again, softer this time. You just stopped seeing me. And with that, I left her sitting in a restaurant she once believed was too good for me, but never realized was mine all along. I didn't set out to build a business. I set out to build a life, one with flavor and depth, not just survival. But life has a way of revealing your strength when everyone else thinks you've already spent it. The Sinclair Group wasn't born from ambition. It was born from necessity, from long nights at a kitchen table surrounded by unpaid invoices and blueprints smudged with coffee stains. It was born in silence, while others slept. When I sat in the glow of a desk lamp, reading contracts line by line, learning not just how to survive, but how to own. The first investment came quietly, a struggling bakery with perfect scones and poor bookkeeping. I believed in the owner, an older woman whose hands trembled when she wrote checks, but whose pastries could melt the coldest morning. I didn't just loan her money. I offered her a way forward, better margins, marketing that didn't rely on foot traffic alone, and a renegotiated lease she didn't know she had the right to ask for. I took no credit. She called me a silent angel. I just called it good business. Then came a wine bar, then a farm-to-table cafe. Each venture was a thread woven carefully into a growing tapestry, never loud, never flashy, just solid, profitable, intentional. I worked through an LLC that bore a different name, not out of shame, but because I liked the power of anonymity. I liked watching people underestimate me, watching their eyes pass over me in boardrooms, only to flinch when I signed the final page. I didn't need the spotlight. I only needed the signature line. When Le Jardin opened, it wasn't our first restaurant, but it was our most personal. My husband's recipes, my financing, our story, wrapped in linens and candlelight. It became the flagship without us calling it that. It was where his legacy bloomed and mine sharpened. That's when I finally put my name on the banner, not just behind the scenes, but above the door. Sinclair, not just a wife, not just a mother, a name with weight, with history, with intention. The Sinclair Group became more than a holding company. It became a signal, a quiet one, but clear. That success doesn't always come from pedigree or pedigree's permission. Sometimes it grows in the quiet moments, when women like me choose not to ask if there's a seat at the table, but build their own instead. My daughter had no idea the scale of what I'd created. She thought of me as someone who budgeted from a place of lack, when really, I budgeted from a place of discipline. She never thought to ask what I'd been building, because she never thought I could. But now, as she sat in my restaurant, blindsided by the weight of what she didn't know, the Sinclair name landed differently. No longer the background. Now, the brand. Before the Sinclair Group was anything more than a folder in my filing cabinet, before Le Jardin had a front door or a single hired chef, I was the woman in the back, washing dishes when the night ran long, refilling salt shakers, folding linen napkins into thirds because the twos looked careless. I never had a title. No one gave me a badge or a business card. I was just his wife, the one who helped out when things got tight. But behind every menu was a grocery list I balanced. Behind every plated entree was a vendor negotiation I handled. Behind every smooth service was a storm I'd already quieted. They called it helping. I called it building. The first restaurant wasn't glamorous. It was a hole-in-the-wall bistro with sticky floors and good intentions. My husband cooked because that's all he knew. I did everything else because someone had to. Bookkeeping, scheduling, taking inventory with a flashlight when the power flickered. When staff didn't show, I rolled up my sleeves. When customers complained, I smiled and took notes. I was the duct tape no one noticed until things didn't fall apart. In time, I learned what I hadn't meant to. Lease law, licensing loopholes, payroll taxes. I sat through meetings pretending to take notes when really, I was memorizing the way the numbers moved. I watched other owners, loud ones, careless ones, lose everything for the simple reason that they thought knowing how to cook was the same thing as knowing how to run a business. So I learned how to do both. Quietly. There was no applause, no promotions, just a slow, steady shift, where helping out became leading, where decision-making became mine by default. When we opened Le Jardin, no one asked who wrote the checks. They assumed. A man in a chef's coat carries credibility, even if he's never opened a spreadsheet. A woman with a calculator just carries the bill, I let them believe what they wanted. Not because I lacked pride, but because I'd come to understand how power behaves when it doesn't have to prove itself. I didn't need a title. I had control. By the time the Sinclair Group became a name worth whispering in back rooms and investor dinners, I'd built a portfolio that stretched across 4 cities, 12 leases, and a dozen profit streams. And still, to my daughter, I was the woman who brought pie to Sunday dinner and probably needed help with her retirement account. She never saw the evolution. But it wasn't her job to. Because some climbs aren't meant to be announced. Some ladders don't creak. Some women build empires not in boardrooms, but in aprons and after hours, where no one claps and nothing comes easy. I started with rubber gloves and a mop bucket. I ended in the owner's chair. Not because I was invited there, but because I earned it, every quiet step of the way. It arrived 3 days after the dinner, hand-delivered in a cream envelope with my name written across the front. Not Mom, not Mother, not even Elaine. Just E. Sinclair, like a formal correspondence to someone they'd only just realized was real. Inside, folded neatly beside a note on heavy cardstock, was a personal check. The amount was precise, exact even. A reimbursement, down to the cent, for the cost of my husband's birthday dinner. They must have called the restaurant, inquired discreetly, and asked for the total bill. They probably thought they were being noble, mature. They probably thought money would tidy what had been made messy. The note was brief. It used all the right words: misunderstanding, unintentional, embarrassed, hope we can move forward. There was a line about how proud they were of me, how impressed they were by the Sinclair Group, and a final sentence that stung more than the rest. You didn't have to pay. We would have handled it if we'd known. If they'd known. As though knowledge, not respect, had been the missing piece. As though the price of dignity could be calculated after the fact. I held the check in my hand for a long time. It was printed on the kind of paper you use when you want to prove you've done well. The kind with metallic threading and a logo in the corner. It smelled like cologne and pride. But all I could see when I looked at it was how small the gesture was. Not in dollars, but in depth. It was money sent in place of remorse. A transaction where a conversation should have been. A peace offering, packaged in digits. I didn't need their money. That was never the issue. I had written bigger checks to strangers. I had donated more to causes they'd never asked about. What I needed, what they still couldn't seem to give, was recognition. Not the applause from a dining room, not a refund. Just the quiet grace of someone saying, I was wrong about you. I didn't see you. And now I do. But they couldn't say that. So they sent a check. I didn't cash it. I didn't rip it up either. I slid it back into the envelope and placed it in the back of my desk drawer, behind a stack of old menus and the original Le Jardin lease agreement, right beside the letter my husband wrote me the night we signed our first partnership together. That one, at least, knew what value was. Julia hadn't called since. Not directly. A few texts. A few half-hearted checking-ins. I hadn't replied. Not out of spite. But because this wasn't a wound that could be mended with money. Forgiveness doesn't come with an invoice. It comes when you stop mistaking silence for weakness and humility for lack. They paid for dinner, but they'd already cost themselves far more. And that balance wasn't something I was willing to settle. I've always believed that family isn't about blood. It's about presence. It's about who shows up. Not just when things are easy, but when they're inconvenient, quiet, and unseen. That night at Le Jardin taught me more than any business deal ever had. It taught me that even the people you raise can unlearn how to value you. That sometimes, what you thought was love was really a pattern, a comfortable one, where I was always the giver, and they were always the assumed recipients. I didn't return Julia's check. I didn't tear it up. I let it sit where it belonged, tucked away, untouched, a quiet reminder that not every offer is worth accepting. She thought she was extending an olive branch. What she didn't realize was that I wasn't standing in her orchard anymore. I had planted my own. So when I called the reservation line for Le Jardin again, I wasn't hiding behind initials or assistants. I gave my name clearly. Mrs. Sinclair. I requested the private dining room for 12. No occasion listed. No explanations offered. The staff didn't ask. They simply said, "Of course." Because this time, it would be different. I invited who I wanted to. Not the people who shared my last name, but the ones who had stood beside me without ever asking for credit. The pastry chef who worked unpaid hours during the early months. The manager who took a pay cut during renovations so the newer staff could stay employed. The dishwasher who always asked how my husband was doing when he got sick last year. People who had shown up again and again, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. That dinner was quiet, intimate. No speeches, no cameras, no performance. Just good food, real laughter, and the kind of comfort that doesn't need to be earned or rehearsed. We passed dishes like family, because that's what we were. Chosen, not inherited. When the final course came, the same waiter who had once addressed me as ma'am without knowing my name, now placed the final plate in front of me with a smile and said, "The kitchen sends this with their thanks, Mrs. Sinclair." He knew. They all did. Not because I demanded respect, but because I had cultivated it. Slowly, quietly, intentionally. Julia never called about that dinner. Maybe she heard about it. Maybe she didn't. But I stopped waiting for her voice to fill the space. The table was full, and for the first time in a long time, so was I. The next reservation will be under my terms. Not because I need control, but because I finally know what I deserve. Respect, warmth, presence, and a seat at the table I set, with no one else deciding whether I've earned it. It was the last toast of the night. No standing ovation, no tinkling of forks against champagne flutes. Just a gentle lifting of glasses among people who understood what it meant to earn their place at a table, not through birthright, but through presence, consistency, and care. The private dining room at Le Jardin glowed with the kind of light that makes everything feel softer. My seat, positioned at the head of the long wooden table, wasn't symbolic. It was earned, and everyone around me knew it. I raised my glass not to make a speech, but to mark a moment. A quiet one. The kind that doesn't shout, but stays with you. To those who showed up, I said simply, letting the words settle in the air like the final notes of a song. There was no need to elaborate. They knew. Every hand lifted. Every eye met mine with something deeper than celebration. It was respect. The real kind. The kind you can't buy, beg for, or bully into existence. The kind that is built over time, brick by unseen brick, on the foundation of integrity. I thought about Julia that night, but only briefly. Not out of longing, and certainly not out of bitterness. Just as a reminder, a caution, that when we assume someone's silence means insignificance, we often miss the truth entirely. I didn't need her apology check. I didn't need her approval. What I needed, I already had. A business built from scratch. A marriage still rooted in mutual reverence. And a legacy with weight. Not because of wealth, but because of grace. Dignity isn't something you demand. It's something you protect. I had learned that in the quiet seasons, when no one was watching. When I was folding napkins alone at midnight, solving crises before anyone else even knew they'd begun. That kind of power, the quiet kind, isn't always flashy, but it is unshakable. And truth? It has a way of rising, no matter how deeply others try to bury it. It sat beside me that night, as real and undeniable as the silverware in our hands. Because no matter how many assumptions were made about me, no matter how many dinners I was left out of, the truth never moved. I was never less than. I was never invisible. I had simply allowed others the comfort of believing I wasn't watching. But I was. And now, they would never forget. As the last plate was cleared and the final guest stood to hug me goodbye, I stayed seated for a moment longer, savoring the stillness, letting it sink in. Respect, served warm, with a side of humility, and seasoned with the kind of power that doesn't need an audience to exist. Just a woman, at her own table, finally seen, exactly as she's always been. They thought they'd excluded a forgotten woman from a table she couldn't afford. What they didn't realize was that I'd built the very foundation beneath their feet. In silence, with grace, I rose, not for revenge, but for remembrance. Not to prove them wrong, but to remember I'd always been right about who I was. I didn't need their permission. I didn't need their praise. I had built my own place, poured my own wine, and invited only those who saw me clearly. This wasn't a reckoning. It was a reclaiming. And I did it all, quietly, powerfully, and on my own terms. Thanks for spending time with this story. If it resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Someone else may need to hear it too. Watch another real-life journey by clicking on the left and subscribe so you never miss what comes next.